Are you worried about the state of the world today and really concerned about what the future holds for you and your children and your children's children? Well, in today's video, we're going to touch upon that and kind of discuss the benefits of studying philosophy to help you understand the world today and make a positive impact. I'm also going to encourage you to use that whether you're at work, in ministry, or pouring into your kids. So let's jump into that. My name is Melissa, although I go by Meli, and I am a licensed therapist in Florida. I'm also a lifelong Christian, homeschooling mom as well to 2 boys, and I'm just super passionate about really equipping women to learn to manage their thoughts so that they can overcome stress, worry, and anxiety and just live a peaceful, confident life with the ones that they love. So this is actually the second video in a series of videos that I'm hoping to do on philosophy. We are actually going to be reading through together this textbook. It's probably going to take quite some time, but I know that it's going to be an amazing opportunity to read together and learn together. So the title of this book is Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, second edition. So if you missed the first video, you can go ahead and click the link in the description, or maybe I'll have a card pop up here and you can do video 1. You could really do it before or after this. It doesn't matter. The information is still going to be helpful one way or another. Just as a quick note, I actually already read through the rest of the somewhat introduction and found it so encouraging, so eye-opening, overwhelming in a good way. Just God giving us all this wisdom and knowledge for this season, for such a time as this, has been such an encouragement to me, and I'm praying that it's also an encouragement to you. I'm picking up on page 4, and it says, since philosophy is foundational to every discipline of the university, philosophy is the most strategic discipline to be influenced for Christ. Malik himself realized and emphasized this. And this is the quote. It will take a different spirit altogether to overcome this great danger of anti-intellectualism. For example, I say this different spirit so far as philosophy alone, the most important domain for thought and intellect is concerned, must see the tremendous value of spending an entire year doing nothing but poring intensely over the Republic, or the Sophists of Plato, or 2 years over the metaphysics or ethics of Aristotle, or 3 years over the City of God of Augustine. So essentially, in what we read previously, we were talking about how there's this sort of move in the Christian church in the United States, specifically a sort of away from philosophy and being able to be eloquent and intelligent and making a case for what you believe, why you believe it, from not only a theological standpoint, but a philosophical standpoint. And so it's so important to have Christians who can eloquently explain why they believe what they believe and what philosophies underground their theology, because it's all about a part of learning. All knowledge and all truth belongs to God, whether you're talking about philosophy, psychology, biology, chemistry, all of the disciplines, right? God is the ultimate authority and creator over all of them. It's a call for Christians to learn philosophy, to make a case and be good apologists, essentially. Keeping on reading here. Now, in one sense, it is theology, not philosophy, that is the most important domain for thought and intellect. I loved this. As the medievals rightly saw, theology is the queen of the sciences, to be studied as the crowning discipline only after one has been trained in the other disciplines. Unfortunately, the queen is currently in exile from the Western University, but her handmaid philosophy still has a stance at court and is thus strategically positioned so as to act on behalf of her queen. The reason Malik could call philosophy, in the absence of the queen, the most important intellectual domain is because it is the most foundational of the disciplines. since it examines the presuppositions and ramifications of every discipline at the university, including itself. Whether it be philosophy of science, philosophy of education, philosophy of law, philosophy of mathematics, or what have you, every discipline will have an associated field of philosophy foundational to that discipline. The philosophy of these respective disciplines is not theologically neutral. Adoption of presuppositions consonant with or inimical to Orthodox Christian theism will have a significant leavening effect throughout that discipline that will, in turn, dispose its practitioners for or against the Christian faith. Christian philosophers, by influencing the philosophy of these various disciplines, can thus help to shape the thinking of the entire university in such a way as to dispose our future generations of leaders to the reception of the gospel. So this, as someone who I went to college for 6 years, 4 years studying psychology, 2 more years studying mental health counseling, can greatly appreciate the fact that philosophy is sort of the foundational perspective of our post-secondary education, right? I wanted to get an advanced degree at some point in my life and was doing research on that, and quickly saw that in terms of academia, the highest or one of the most respected is the PhD, right? Also, just in society, people can recognize a PhD and see its value as a doctoral degree, right? And that is a doctorate in philosophy. And the whole idea of philosophy is to understand the foundation of whatever it is you're studying, understand the presuppositions and ramifications of whatever it is that you're studying. I thought that was really interesting because it was talking about medieval times and how much the church had a massive impact on the university system. When we think about, the universities, even the big ones, right, in the United States, like Duke and Harvard and Yale, a lot of these were first and foremost known for their theological studies, for bringing forth wonderful ministers and pastors who were seen as an ultimate authority in terms of intellect and education, and not only understanding the physical world but also the spiritual or the metaphysical. It's interesting to see this shift that has happened over the last 100 years in terms of secular education or just education, how post-secondary education has become so secular. Oh my gosh, I took allergy medication today and it seems like my allergies are worse than ever. It is already happening. Over the last 40 years, a revolution has been occurring in Anglo-American philosophy. Since the late 1960s, Christian philosophers have been coming out and defending the truth of the Christian worldview with philosophically sophisticated arguments in the finest scholarly journals and professional societies, and the face of Anglo-American philosophy has been transformed as a result. In an article lamenting the desecularization of academia that evolved in philosophy departments since the late 1960s, one atheist philosopher observes that whereas theists and other disciplines tend to compartmentalize their theistic beliefs from their professional work, in philosophy it became almost overnight academically respectable to argue for theism, belief in a god, making philosophy a favored field of entry for the most intelligent and talented theists entering academia today, end quote. He complains, quote, naturalists passively watched as realist versions of theism began to sweep through the philosophical community. Until today, perhaps 1/4 or 1/3 of philosophy professors are theists, with most being Orthodox Christians, end quote. He concludes, quote, God is not dead in academia. He returned to life in the late 1960s and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments. End quote. This is the testament of a prominent atheist philosopher to the change that has transpired before his eyes in Anglo-American philosophy. He is probably exaggerating when he estimates that 1/4 to 1/3 of American philosophers are theists, but what his estimates do reveal is the perceived impact of Christian philosophers on this field. Like Gideon's army, a committed minority of activists can have an impact far out of proportion to their numbers. The principal error he makes is calling philosophy departments God's, quote, last stronghold at the university. On the contrary, philosophy departments are a beachhead from which operations can be launched to influence other departments at the university for Christ, thereby helping to transform the socio-cultural milieu in which we live. All right, so I just want to do a quick commentary here. Again, I went to college for 6 years. It was a secular university down in Miami, Florida, called Florida International University. As I reflect back, now that I'm almost 40 years old and I graduated back in 2009, so 16 years ago, I could definitely see how, from my perspective, I didn't really encounter any overtly Christian professors or necessarily anti-Christian professors personally. I know my sister had a different experience when she was studying social work. It is an encouragement to see that there is an increase, apparently, of Christians studying philosophy in the secular, university system, because I know that for myself with like homeschooling and being part of a church community and Christian, co-ops and homeschool groups, sometimes we can fall into this habit of wanting to kind of self segregate into our Christian community and forget the importance of remembering that we're in the world and not of it, and that we're called to go out and make disciples of all nations. And for a lot of us, if we go into the university system and study, that's a great ground for us to do that, to, be ambassadors for Christ, to not be afraid to speak up for truth as we believe it to be, and I don't know, to engage our professors and to share what we believe, like Timothy writes, right, with gentleness and with respect. I think that's a wonderful thing. But it is not just those who plan to enter the academy professionally who need to have training in philosophy. Christian philosophy is also an integral part of training for Christian ministry. A model for us here is a man like John Wesley, who was at once a spirit-filled revivalist and an Oxford-educated scholar. In 1756, Wesley delivered an address to the clergy, which he commended to all future ministers when commencing their seminary studies. In discussing what sort of abilities a minister ought to have, Wesley distinguished between natural gifts and acquired abilities. And it is extremely instructive to look at the abilities Wesley thought a minister ought to acquire. One of them is a basic grasp of philosophy. He challenged his audience to ask themselves, quote, "Am I a tolerable master of the sciences? Have I gone through the very gate of them, logic? If not, I am not likely to go much farther when I stumble at the threshold. Rather, have not my stupid indolence and laziness made me very ready to believe what the little wits and pretty gentlemen affirm, quote, that logic is good for nothing? End quote. It is good for this, at least, to make people talk less, by showing them both what is and what is not, to the point, and how extremely hard it is to prove anything. Do I understand metaphysics? If not the depths of the schoolmen, the subtleties of Scotus or Aquinas, yet the first rudiments, the general principles of that useful science? Have I conquered so much of it as to clear my apprehension and range my ideas under proper heads, so much as enables me to read with ease and pleasure, as well as profit, Dr. Henry Moore's work, Malebranche's Search for Truth, and Dr. Clarke's Demonstration of Being and Attributes of God? End quote. Wesley's vision of a pastor is remarkable, a gentleman skilled in the scriptures and conversant with history, philosophy, and the science of his day. How do the pastors graduating from our seminaries compare to this model? Again, encouragement to not take offense if you're thinking about yourself or your pastor or anything like that. It's just making a case. This whole book is for making a case regarding the importance of learning philosophy, being intelligent, and being able to make an intelligible argument for what you believe as a Christian and being able to have that conversation translate to all the other sciences, whether it's philosophy, metaphysics, physics, chemistry, biology. I mean, we see that in our society today, right? The authors of this book can both testify personally to the immense practicality and even indispensability of philosophical training for Christian ministry. For many years, we have each been involved not just in scholarly work, but also in speaking evangelistically on university campuses with groups like InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Crew, and the Veritas Forum. Again and again, we have seen the practical value of philosophical studies in teaching students for Christ. From questions dealing with the meaning of life or the basis of moral values to the problem of suffering and evil and the challenge of religious pluralism, students are asking profound philosophical questions that are much more difficult to answer than to pose. They deserve a thoughtful response rather than pat answers or appeals to mystery. The conventional wisdom says, quote, you can't use arguments to bring people to Christ, end quote. This has not been our experience. In fact, there is tremendous interest among unbelieving students in hearing a rational presentation and defense of the gospel, and some will be ready to respond with trust in Christ. To speak frankly, we do not know how one could minister effectively in a public way on our university campuses without training in philosophy. And I'm just going to say something real quick there. I mean, yeah, these are the hard questions, even as a PK, preacher's kid, growing up in the public school system from kindergarten to grade 12 to master's, right? Also, my school was secular. A lot of times people would ask me these profound questions that at the time when I was younger, I really didn't have answers to. And looking back, I think it'd be nice if I did, or if there were adults around, especially in the university system, who would train us up in answering those, whether it was for a Christian like myself who didn't know how to answer them, or for those who were looking for coherent, rational, intellectually, put together answers to those questions. Finally, it is not just scholars and ministers who will benefit from training in philosophy, but also lay people who need to be intellectually engaged if our culture is to be effectively reformed. Our churches are unfortunately overly populated with people whose minds, as Christians, are going to waste. As Malik observed, they may be spiritually regenerate, but their minds have not been converted. They still think like non believers. Despite their Christian commitment, they remain largely empty shelves. What is an empty shelf? An empty shelf is a person who is passive, sensate, busy and hurried, and capable of developing an interior life. Such a person is inordinately individualistic, infantile, and narcissistic. And I put a note here on the side when it said narcissistic, right? As a therapist, I put this sounds like our culture in a nutshell. It is very inherently narcissistic, self centered. It's all about what makes me happy, what makes me feel good. And you see those, and that all comes from philosophy, right? Hedonism. If it's good for you, if it makes you feel good, if it makes you happy, then it's not bad. That comes from philosophical teachings that have made their way into our culture. And if we're not aware of that, well, then how do we engage in polite conversations that are intellectually stimulating but also convicting? Imagine how a church filled with such people Okay, excuse me. Imagine a now a church filled with such people. What will be the theological understanding, the evangelistic courage, the cultural penetration of such a church? If the interior life does not really matter at all that much, why should one spend time trying to develop an intellectual, spiritually mature life? Pause. I feel like Zach from Saved by the Bell. Freeze. I was just thinking, it's talking about our internal life, right? Our interior life, our thought processes, which in our world today, mental health has become so widely accepted in terms of going to therapy and self development and self help and self actualization and self, 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 self. But what about intellect? What about being able to understand our culture, our society, the thoughts that have shaped what we have been taught in school, what we are taught in school, and what is the underpinning of how we make decisions and how we evaluate and value what is good, what is right, what is just, what is unjust, right? From a secular perspective in our secular, very secular country. And what is the Christian alternative? If someone is basically passive, he will just not make the effort to read, preferring instead to be entertained. Boom, I put wow on that one. Yeah. If a person is sensate in orientation, then music, magazines filled with pictures, and visual media in general will be more important than mere words on a page or abstract thoughts. If one is hurried and distracted, one will have little patience for theoretical knowledge and too short an attention span to stay with an idea while it is being carefully developed. And if someone is overly individualistic, infantile, and narcissistic, what will that person read, if he reads at all? Books about Christian celebrities, Christian romance novels imitating the worst that the world has to offer, Christian self help books filled with slogans, simplistic moralizing, lots of stories and pictures, and inadequate diagnoses of the problems facing the reader. Boom. What will not be read are books that equip people to develop a well reasoned theological understanding of the Christian faith and to assume their role in the broader work of the kingdom of God. Such a church will become impotent to stand against the powerful forces of secularism that threaten to wash away Christian ideas in a flood of thoughtless pluralism and misguided scientism. Such a church will be tempted to measure her success largely in terms of numbers achieved by cultural accommodation or empty shelves. In this way, the church will become her own grave digger, for her means of short-term success will turn out in the long run to be the very thing that buries her. This is what I get from that. If we're not challenging each other as Christians to think deeply and thoughtfully and to really evaluate what we do with our time, it's like the parable of the talents. What are we doing with the time that God has given us? How are we investing that time? How are we investing in the intellect that he's given us in the information age that we live in? What have we done with that? If we're wasting it away with just being entertained and not much more, then the church may in some ways self-destruct. And I don't want to get too political, but there have been a lot of changes in a lot of denominations, like the Methodists, even the Southern Baptists, the Lutherans, and others that have really veered away from a very traditional Judeo-Christian worldview. We're seeing right now the destruction of the church in the United States. It's very sad. And when we're worried more so about numbers and bringing people in and defining success by having huge congregations, but not by really sharing the truth, because the gospel is offensive. And of course, people are going to turn away and they're going to have to really get with God and pray and deal with some difficult things and pray for healing and, wrestle with God like Jacob did until they're hopefully blessed with the gift of faith and truth and receive joy and hope like we've seen with, I couldn't help but just think of Russell Brand right now. But yeah, people need to hear the truth, wrestle with it, and learn and come out the other side and, decide where they want to be when it comes to that. So anyway, all of this is very interconnected. What makes this envisioned scenario so distressing is that we do not have to imagine such a church. Rather, this is an apt description of far too many American evangelical churches today. It is no wonder, then, that despite its resurgence, evangelical Christianity has been thus far so limited in its cultural impact. David Wells reflects, quote, "The vast growth in evangelical-minded people should by now have revolutionized American culture, with a third of American adults now claiming to have experienced spiritual rebirth, a powerful countercurrent of morality growing out of a powerful and alternative worldview should have been unleashed in factories, offices, boardrooms, the media, universities, professions, from one end of the country to the other. The result should by now be an the results should by now be unmistakable. Secular values should be reeling, and those who are in their proponents should be very troubled. Those who are their proponents should be very troubled. But as it turns out, all this swelling of the evangelical ranks has passed unnoticed in the culture. The presence of evangelicals in American culture has barely caused a ripple. End quote. The problems as well is that while evangelicals have for the most part correct Christian beliefs, for far too many, these beliefs lie largely at the periphery of their existence rather than at the center of their identity. Identity, huge one. I marked that. A lot of times we think our identity is the job that we do, the work that we do, the hobbies that we have, sexual orientation, fill in the blanks. We think that our identity is out, these things. But our identity as Christians is that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that God breathed life into us. There is a plan and a purpose for each individual person's life, and our identity is then centered on that, and then seeking out, okay, this God who created me, who is he? What message does he have for me? What has he taught me through his word, the Bible? If you're a Christian, right, that's what you're going to be looking at. And that is what we center ideally our identity on. Not our denomination, not any other checkbox. It's being a child of God, and what does he direct us to do, right? To say, to believe, to think, to feel. How does he direct us to act? So instead of that being on the periphery, sort of out here, a box that we check on a long list of things that defines who we are, should actually be at the very center of every decision, of every conversation, of just who we are as people. All right, wrapping up here. At the core, they are hollow men, empty shelves. If we as the church are to engender a current of reform throughout our culture, then we need lay people who are intellectually engaged with their faith and to take their Christian identity to be definitive for their self-conception. Besides cultural reform, a revival of intellectual engagement is absolutely critical for restoring vibrant, life-transforming apprenticeship under the lordship of Jesus, the master teacher. No apprentice will become like his teacher if he does not respect the authority of that teacher to direct the apprentice's life and activities. However, today, the authority of the Bible in general and of Jesus Christ in particular is widely disregarded. The general attitude, even among many of Christ's own followers, is that while Jesus Christ is holy, powerful, and so forth, the worldview he taught and from which he lived is no longer credible for thinking people. As Dallas Willard observes, quote, "The crushing weight of the secular outlook permeates or pressures every thought we have today. Sometimes it even forces those who self-identify as Christian teachers to set aside Jesus's plain statements about the reality and total relevance of the kingdom of God and replace them with philosophical speculations, whose only recommendation is their consistency with a, quote, modern contemporary mindset. The powerful, though vague and unsubstantiated presumption is that something has been found out that renders a spiritual understanding of reality in the manner of Jesus simply foolish to those who are, quote, in the know," end quote. Willard concludes that in order to restore spiritual vitality to the church, we must recapture a view of Jesus as an intellectually competent person who knew what he was talking about. For Willard, who is himself a philosopher, this will include revitalizing philosophical reflection in the church. Philosophical reflection is indeed a powerful means of kindling the fire in the mind in Christian discipleship and in the church. Again, the authors of this book can testify that our worship of God is deeper, precisely because of, not in spite of, our philosophical studies. As we reflect philosophically on our various ideas of specialization within the field of philosophy, our appreciation of God's truth and all of his person have become more profound. We look forward to future study because of the deeper appreciation we are sure it will bring of God's person and work. Christian faith is not an apathetic faith, a brain dead faith, but a living, inquiring faith. As Anselm put it, ours is a faith that seeks understanding. These are very exciting times in which to be alive and working in the field of philosophy, where God is doing a fresh work before our eyes. It is our hope and prayer that He would be pleased to use this book to call even more Christian thinkers to this effervescing field and to equip the church and her ministers to serve Him and His kingdom even more effectively into the 21st century. So ending there, there's like a second part to that that is an invitation to dialogue and then acknowledgments, but we'll skip over that because there's no like teaching there. It's just basically saying, oh, we're going to discuss our view on certain topics of in philosophy, but you might have a different view. I am completely new to the study of philosophy, so this is all going to be very fresh and new to me. So if this is also very fresh and new to you as well, make sure you subscribe. My goal is to post at least one video a month. I would like to post more than that, reading through this book. And I will also have this book linked in the description if you want to buy it and read along with me. It is basically a very long textbook. It did say in that dialogue that you don't have to read it chapter by chapter, especially if you're teaching a philosophy class. You can just, choose a chapter to assign and kind of work from there. But I think what I'm going to do is just go chapter by chapter, because why not? I mean, even if it takes quite some time to get through, I think it'll be time well spent. And I would encourage you to not forsake your personal Bible study time, especially, as a Christian. I would encourage you to do that first, first thing in the morning. Take 5 minutes to read and study the Word of God and pray and meditate throughout that, throughout your day on what you're reading and what you're learning. And then this is just fun extra reading that will equip you and stimulate your mind and get you thinking more deeply about the Christian walk, the Christian faith, and how philosophy can help us answer some difficult questions that our friends, families, coworkers, kids may ask us.